5 in the morning. The city lights flickered against the damp pavement, casting long, fractured shadows across the construction site. Miguel stepped past the gate, his boots heavy on the wet gravel. 3 decades of this. 3 decades of gripping steel rebar until his palms turned to thick, unyielding leather. He shifted his weight, and the familiar, sharp ache flared across his lower back, a dull reminder of every heavy timber he had hauled. His lungs pulled in the cold, dusty air, heavy with the scent of wet concrete and exhaust. Around him, the site remained mostly silent, waiting for the roar of machinery. He reached out to test the tension on a support beam, his calloused fingers tracing the rough metal. Every movement was efficient, stripped of wasted energy. He had learned the rhythm of this labor over thousands of shifts. It was a repetitive, grinding existence that demanded his full strength before the sun even cleared the horizon. He stood there for a moment, listening to the distant hum of the waking city. Before he turned toward the stacks of material, the work was already waiting. He took a breath, locked his grip onto the first load of the day, and began the cycle once more. The crew arrived in a chorus of heavy boots and loud greetings. Miguel kept his head down, moving with the same measured pace he used for lifting steel. He navigated the narrow aisle between rows of rusted metal lockers, his space tucked into the furthest, dimmest corner. He spun the dial of his lock left, right, left until the mechanism clicked. He pulled the door open just wide enough to slide inside. Behind a stack of spare work gloves, he reached into the back panel and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. It was frayed at the edges, the pages dense with cramped handwriting. He held it for a heartbeat, his thumb tracing the worn spine, before tucking it back into its hiding spot. He checked over his shoulder. The rest of the crew was busy swapping stories and checking their gear, their voices echoing off the concrete walls. Nobody looked his way. He closed the locker, spun the dial, and secured it. To them, he was just another man trading sweat for a paycheck. They had no idea that while they talked about weekend plans, he was mentally balancing a ledger that stretched years into the future. He grabbed his hard hat, shut the locker door with a firm metallic clang, and walked back out to join the others, his expression as blank and unreadable as the concrete they were about to pour. The sun had dipped below the skyline when Miguel arrived at the community center. He pushed through the heavy glass doors, leaving the grit and noise of the site behind. The room was dim, lit only by a few flickering overhead bulbs that cast long, steady shadows across the rows of folding chairs. He found a seat in the back, his hands still stained with the residue of the day's concrete. At the front of the room, a man stood behind a wooden podium, pointing to a series of diagrams sketched onto a whiteboard. Miguel leaned forward, his focus sharpening. The speaker moved past the usual talk of luck or inheritance. He began to map out a sequence, drawing lines that connected individual actions to long-term outcomes. He spoke of assets as gears in a machine. He argued that wealth was not a sudden windfall, but a predictable result of a rigid, underlying system. Miguel watched the chalk move across the board, connecting the dots. He felt the weight of 3 decades of aimless labor shift. For the first time, he saw the future not as an unpredictable storm to be weathered, but as a path to be built. He sat still, watching the diagram, realizing that the only thing missing from his life was a set of instructions. Miguel bypassed the television and the kitchen table, heading straight for the small desk in his bedroom. He clicked the light on. The bulb buzzed, casting a harsh yellow glow over the surface. He pulled the leather-bound notebook from his bag and laid it flat. His hands, still stiff from the day's heavy lifting, gripped a ballpoint pen. He did not rush. He opened to the first blank page, pressed the nib against the paper, and began to map the math. 1 rental property every 3 years. He underlined the phrase twice, the ink bleeding slightly into the grain of the page. He sketched a timeline beneath it, marking intervals of 36 months. He ignored the temptation to dream of luxury or immediate exit strategies. He focused strictly on the numbers, the accumulation of equity, the compounding of rent, the sheer mechanical repetition required to reach the end. He drew lines, calculated years, and verified the totals. There was no room for luck in these columns. He added a final note at the bottom of the page. No shortcuts. He closed the book, sat back, and listened to the hum of the refrigerator. The goal was no longer a vague hope. It was a contract, signed and dated, waiting for him to begin the work. The construction site buzzed with the arrival of new chrome. Every Monday, another coworker pulled into the lot behind the wheel of a high-interest, extended cab truck. They gathered near the tool shed, keys jingling, comparing horsepower and monthly payment plans. Miguel stood 5 yards away, his own rusted sedan parked in the far corner where the gravel turned to dirt. He checked his watch, adjusted his gear, and walked past the group without stopping. One of them pointed at his sedan, laughing about the failing clear coat and the rattle in the engine. Miguel did not look back. He kept his pace steady, his gaze fixed on the job ahead. When the shift ended, the group invited him to join them for a celebratory drink at the local grill. He declined, citing a need to get home. He watched them pile into their oversized vehicles, the exhaust clouds hanging heavy in the cool evening air. He turned his key in his own ignition, listening to the familiar, uneven idle of his engine. He pulled out of the lot, leaving the noise behind. The isolation felt heavy, like a physical weight in the cab, but he did not deviate. He drove in silence, focused on the 3-year mark etched in his notebook. Vacation season hit the construction site like a fever. Maps were pinned to the break room wall. Brochures to exhaust tropical resorts littered the common tables. Colleagues booked flights, counting down the days until they could trade their labor for a week of sun. Miguel spent those mornings reviewing his own ledger. He saw the travel flyers and felt the pull of the brochures, but he folded them away and replaced them with his bank statements. Every dollar he earned was a soldier, and he refused to let them desert their post. He walked to the bank every Friday. He bypassed the teller and used the machine, watching the numbers climb. Each deposit was a concrete brick in a wall he was building against the future. He did not see a missed vacation. He saw the down payment for his first asset. He tracked the interest rates, moving his money into high-yield accounts that demanded patience. He watched his balance swell while his peers returned from their trips with empty pockets and renewed debt. He kept his head down, his focus sharpened by the math. He was not depriving himself of life. He was buying the foundation for his own autonomy. By the end of the month, his account hit the target. The sacrifice was complete. The money was ready to work. The office smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. Miguel sat in a plastic chair, watching the clock tick. He placed his pen on the desk, the ink cartridge full. Across from him, the agent slid the final papers forward. Miguel scanned the lines, checking the math against his notebook. He signed his name 4 times, the tip of the pen tearing slightly at the heavy bond paper. The agent shook his hand, the grip firm and professional. Miguel stepped outside into the afternoon glare. He drove to the address he had memorized months ago. The house sat at the end of a quiet street, its siding weathered and grayed by years of exposure. Weeds pushed through the cracks in the walkway, and the front porch sagged toward the left. He walked up the steps, the wood groaning under his weight. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the heavy brass key, and held it against the lock. The metal felt cold and solid. He turned the key. The bolt clicked, and the door swung open. The air inside was still and smelled of dry timber. He stepped across the threshold, his boots clicking on the hardwood floor. He stood in the center of the living room, looking at the peeling wallpaper and the dust motes dancing in the light. He was the owner. The plan had shifted from numbers on a page to physical space. Miguel did not sit down. He did not open a bottle or call anyone. He walked through the rooms once, checking the locks and the window seals, then returned to his truck. He pulled his notebook from the glove box and opened to the back page. He crossed out the goal for the first property and wrote the date. Below it, he drew a new line, calculating the start of the next 3-year cycle. He snapped the notebook shut and started the engine. The drive back to the construction site was silent. He did not let himself linger on the quiet of the house or the weight of the keys in his pocket. He understood the trap of the finish line. If he stopped now, the momentum would die. He arrived at the site just as the sun began to climb. He changed into his work boots, walked past the foreman, and picked up the heavy rebar he had dropped the day before. The house was not a retirement. It was an engine. He had to keep feeding it. He spent the next 8 hours moving timber and pouring concrete, his hands working with the same rhythm they had held for years. To the men around him, he was just a laborer. To Miguel, he was the architect of a machine that had finally begun to turn. By the 12th year, the rhythm of the strategy shifted. It was no longer just about his own savings. The rental income began to do the heavy lifting. Miguel sat at his kitchen table every month, tracking the numbers as the rent checks flowed in. They were not large amounts, but they were consistent. He watched the balance in his account rise, month after month, until it crossed the threshold required for a third down payment. He did not rush to spend it. He waited for the market to dip, his notebook open, checking the math against the current interest rates. When the moment arrived, he moved with practiced efficiency. He met with the bank, signed the paperwork, and secured the third property. The momentum was now self-sustaining. The rent from the first two houses covered the mortgage on the third, while his own labor at the construction site continued to fuel his personal savings. He saw the shift in his bank statements. The money was compounding, independent of his physical presence at the site. He walked through the new property on a Tuesday morning, checking the plumbing and the electrical lines. The house was another gear in the machine. He had built a system that functioned even when he was pouring concrete. The math was working exactly as he had sketched it years ago. The market began to roar with speculative fervor. His coworkers spent their lunch breaks talking about quick flips and high-risk stocks, their eyes wide with the promise of sudden wealth. They watched the news, tracked the daily fluctuations, and complained about missed opportunities when the market shifted. Miguel listened, but he did not engage. He checked his watch, finished the last of his coffee, and stood up to return to the site. He had no interest in the volatile trends that consumed their attention. His focus remained fixed on the rigid 3-year cycle he had defined decades ago. While others chased the noise, he calculated the next move in his own timeline. He ignored the headlines that drove his peers to distraction. He did not care about the hype of the moment. His discipline was a wall, built from years of repetition and absolute refusal to deviate from the math. He saw their panic, their excitement, and their disappointment, and it only confirmed his resolve. He knew the difference between a shortcut and a system. When a coworker tried to convince him to pool money into a trending venture, Miguel simply shook his head and picked up his shovel. He stayed the course, one cycle at a time, indifferent to the shifting tides of the market. By the time Miguel turned 50, the strategy had reached a quiet, inevitable conclusion. He stood on the scaffolding, drill in hand, watching the city skyline, but his mind no longer traced the math of his next down payment. He did not need to. The portfolio had crossed a critical threshold, evolving into a self-sustaining machine. The properties now generated enough capital to maintain themselves, pay down their own debts, and expand without requiring a single dollar from his weekly construction paycheck. The heavy lifting had shifted from his calloused hands to the system he had built over 2 decades. He observed the transition in the silence of his evenings. There were no more frantic calculations or midnight sessions with the notebook. The engine ran on its own momentum, churning out value with the steady, rhythmic persistence of a heartbeat. He held the keys to a dozen doors, and each one contributed to a collective force that had become larger than his own labor. The machine did not require his constant supervision. It simply existed, growing and thriving while he continued his daily routine. He had successfully decoupled his survival from his physical exertion. The design was complete, the gears were locked, and the machine was finally doing the work that he had spent half a lifetime preparing it to do. The work remained grueling. Miguel hauled heavy timber across the site, his shoulders burning and his boots caked in fresh cement. He spent his days in the dust, trading physical effort for a daily wage, just as he had for 30 years. Yet, the rhythm of his life had fundamentally altered. During a brief pause in the morning, he pulled his phone from his pocket. A series of notifications flickered across the screen. Rent deposits, automated transfers, and maintenance balances. The numbers arrived with the steady, mechanical precision of a clock. While he wiped the grime from his forehead, his bank account was quietly swelling, covering his mortgage, his utilities, and his living costs with total indifference to his current fatigue. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and picked up a heavy rebar frame. The contrast was stark. His body was still doing the work of a laborer, but his finances were now operating on a completely different plane. He did not need the paycheck he was currently earning. He was working because he chose to, not because he had to. Every drop of sweat he poured into the concrete was no longer a necessity for his survival, but a choice in a day that belonged entirely to him. The machine he built was working harder than he was. The midday whistle cut through the site. Miguel walked to the shade of a but lowered his frame onto a stack of lumber. and opened his weathered lunchbox. It was the same routine he had followed for 3 decades. A sandwich wrapped in wax paper, a piece of fruit, and a battered steel thermos. Across the site, a younger worker stood near the heavy machinery, wiping grease from his hands. He stopped mid-sentence, his gaze drifting from his own expensive store-bought meal toward the quiet space where Miguel sat. The younger man's eyes locked onto the thermos. He didn't look away. He watched Miguel unscrew the cap with a steady, practiced hand, the steam rising into the cool air. The conversation among the other crew members continued, but the younger worker remained silent, his brow furrowed in a sudden, sharp curiosity. He began to walk toward Miguel, his boots crunching loudly over the gravel. The distance between them closed, measured in slow, deliberate steps. The air around the break area grew heavy, the usual casual banter fading into the background. Something about the simplicity of the lunch and the calm precision of the older man's movements had triggered a flicker of disbelief. The younger man stopped just a few feet away, his mouth opening to speak, his eyes searching for an answer to a question he was only beginning to formulate. The younger man did not immediately speak. He stood with his thumbs hooked into his belt, his eyes darting from the worn lunchbox to the towering steel frame of the skyscraper they were currently building. He looked at the surrounding city, a horizon packed with concrete and glass, then back at Miguel. The skepticism was etched into his face, a mixture of confusion and intense demand. He kicked a loose rock with the toe of his boot, the sound sharp and jarring against the low hum of the site. The other workers had drifted away, leaving them in a pocket of silence. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly tone that cut through the noise of the machinery. He gestured vaguely at the skyline, his hand trembling slightly with the weight of his own frustration. "I hear the rumors. Miguel, they say you own half the block, maybe more. I see you here every day, hauling the same loads as the rest of us, eating the same cheap food." He paused, his gaze hardening as he searched for a flicker of recognition in the older man's eyes. "How does a laborer, a man who spends his life in the mud, end up owning buildings? What is the trick? What are you not telling the rest of us?" Miguel did not look up immediately. He set the thermos back onto the lumber, the metal clicking against the wood with a dull, final sound. He wiped his hands on his palms, the skin rough and mapped with the history of 3 decades of labor. The silence stretched, long enough for the distant roar of the city to seem like a faint, irrelevant hum. He reached down, fingers tracing the worn edge of the plastic lunchbox, feeling the familiar texture of a tool that had served him longer than any machine. He looked up, meeting the younger man's eyes. His expression remained level, devoid of the defensiveness the worker had clearly expected. Miguel reached out, tapping the lid of the box with a single calloused finger. He spoke, his voice steady, stripped of any pretense or hidden complexity. "I chose to bring my lunch for 30 years. The words hung in the space between them, stark and unadorned. There was no mention of secret markets or lucky breaks, just the physical weight of 1,000 small, consistent refusals to spend. The younger man blinked, his mouth parting slightly, the gravity of the statement hitting him with a force that had nothing to do with volume. It was the sound of a lifetime of quiet, disciplined design finally laid bare. The younger man stared for a heartbeat, his brow furrowed, before a sharp, incredulous laugh broke from his throat. He shook his head, looking back at the skyscraper as if expecting the answer to be written in the steel beams above. "That is it?" he asked, his voice rising with a mix of frustration and genuine amusement. "You really expect me to believe that a lunchbox built a fortune?" He laughed again, a hollow, rhythmic sound that seemed to bounce off the nearby construction debris. He turned away, his shoulders hunching as he dismissed the explanation with a wave of his hand. He clearly found the answer insulting, a pathetic reduction of a life he assumed must have been governed by secrets or luck. Miguel did not join in. He did not smile. He did not even blink. He remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the younger man's back as he walked away toward the mixing station. The divide between them was not a matter of age or experience. It was a wall of perspective. One man saw only the surface of the lunchbox, while the other saw the 30 years of compound decisions that had paved his path to freedom. The laughter faded into the distance, leaving only the sound of machinery, and Miguel simply picked up his tools to finish the day. The sound of the younger man's footsteps faded into the rhythmic thrum of the site. Miguel stood alone amidst the rebar and dust, his gaze dropping to his own hands. They were cracked, stained with concrete, and permanently mapped by 3 decades of heavy lifting. For years, he had viewed these hands as mere instruments of labor, the tools that traded bone and muscle for a basic paycheck. But as the sun dipped lower, casting long, sharp shadows across the site, a shift occurred in his perspective. He looked at the concrete base he had poured that morning, then back at his palms. The manual grind had never been the end. It was the foundation. While his body weathered the heavy timber and the biting dust, his money had been working in a quiet, invisible parallel. Thousands of mornings spent in this exact spot were not lost time. They were the engine of his eventual liberation. He flexed his fingers, feeling the familiar ache of the joints, and felt a surge of cold, sharp pride. He had not been a victim of the system, or a prisoner of his station. He had been the architect of his own escape, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. Every drop of sweat had been a calculated investment in a future he had designed himself. Miguel took a slow breath, letting the heavy air of the construction site fill his lungs one last time. He searched his memory for a single lucky break, a hidden tip, or a stroke of fortune that might have accelerated the process. He found nothing. There was no secret meeting, no inheritance, and no windfall that had tipped the scales in his favor. Every asset in his portfolio was the direct result of a math-based decision made 3 decades ago. He remembered the nights he spent at the community center, the cold calculations in his notebook, and the steady, grinding discipline of his early years. There had been moments where he could have taken a shortcut, where he could have bought the new truck or chased a speculative trend, but he had chosen the slower, harder path instead. The freedom he now possessed was not a gift he had stumbled upon. It was a structure he had built with his own hands, day by agonizing day. He realized that the absence of a shortcut was the very reason his foundation had held firm. He had not been lucky. He had been precise. The weight of this realization settled in his chest, replacing the exhaustion of the day with a profound, quiet sense of victory. He had manufactured his own destiny, and the result was absolute. The final morning arrived without fanfare. Around him, the air was thick with the usual murmur of men nearing the end of their working lives, their voices tight with the common, gnawing panic of shrinking savings and uncertain horizons. They traded stories of fear, of how much time remained, and how little buffer they had against the coming years. Miguel listened, but the weight of those worries did not touch him. He moved through the familiar chaos of the site with a calm that felt alien to the space. He did not check his watch to see how much time he had left to survive. He checked it only to mark the completion of his design. While others braced for a future defined by scarcity, he walked toward a horizon he had already secured. He felt no urge to rush, no need to look back at the structures he had helped raise. His focus remained entirely on the quiet, steady reality of his own life. He took one last look at the concrete slab, felt the solid ground beneath his boots, and knew that his exit was not a retreat. It was a planned departure. He had traded the uncertainty of the future for the absolute security of his own discipline, and in that knowledge, he found a profound, unwavering silence. He walked toward the gate, the sounds of the site fading into a dull, distant hum. For 3 decades, this ground had been his world, a place of dust, heavy loads, and repetitive strain. Now, it was simply a memory he was choosing to leave behind. He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred, and saw not just the evidence of labor, but the tools that had constructed his autonomy. The extraordinary life he now possessed was not hidden in a vault. It was woven into the thousands of ordinary mornings he had committed to his plan. He had traded the fleeting comforts of his youth for the enduring power of his own design. As he cleared the perimeter fence, the city traffic blurred into a rhythmic flow. He did not look back. There was no need to survey the structures he had built for others when his own foundation was finally complete. He stepped onto the sidewalk and kept walking, his stride steady, his mind entirely his own. The transformation was total. He had taken the mundane rhythm of a working life and forged it into a permanent state of liberty. He was no longer trading time for survival. He was the architect of his own existence, and for the first time in 30 years, the day ahead belonged to him alone.